Hey there everybody, it's Mike DiLisio with another solo mode review. Today I'm going to be taking a look at the solo mode for Sarah's Vision from designers Anthony Hagago, Archie Edwards, and Peter Blankhorn, and publisher Balois Group. Sarah's Vision is a cooperative game where you are trying to work against a series of events that are causing danger, and you're doing this through a Jenga-style block stacking mechanic. Let's head on over to the table, I'll show you how it plays, then we'll come back here and I'll give you my final thoughts. Okay, here we have a solo setup for Sarah's Vision. I've got this set up for the introductory scenario. There are 3 different scenarios that contain these event cards that are going to basically determine the challenges that you have to face within the game. And so, how does the setup or components differ from the multiplayer game? The answer is none, not at all. This is exactly the same as the multiplayer game. Really, nothing changes in the solo game except that you are controlling all of the action. It is a pure co-op. No adjustments need to be made, no changes to setup, no changes to the rules. Everything plays exactly the same as in the multiplayer game. And so, generally, the idea behind this is that you are trying to get through that whole deck of 20 event cards. Now, there's actually a few more than 20 because there's these story cards that are built in that give you a little bit of a narrative to the game as you play through. You don't have to have those story cards in. And actually, there's an experienced mode where if you've already played through the game before and you're just trying to kind of change things up and make it more challenging, instead of having it in a prescribed order, because right now this event deck is in a strict numbered order from 1 to 20, you could take those story cards out and shuffle them up randomly so that you don't, if you've already kind of known how these come out, you can have a better idea on how to kind of work through these problems. And so that experience mode is if you've already played through a scenario a time or two and you kind of know the order, you're not playing exactly the same game every time. So generally speaking, you've got these actions that you can take. And on your turn, you take one of these 5 actions. Then you're going to resolve the event card, play any directive cards you may have, and pick up any danger and inspiration that might be on the spaces where your 3 characters are located. Here you've got a senator, an engineer, and a scientist. They start on these spots. I have 1 inspiration cube in each of these areas, in the leadership spot for the senator, the technical area for the engineer, and the scientific area for the scientist. And so, these are costs, and those costs are based upon the colored blocks that you have over there. And here you've got your tower of blocks, and you basically have to kind of remove those blocks, Jenga style, from there to pay for these actions. And what this card is telling me is that there are a number of danger that are going to come out on this corresponding grid. So if you see this 3x3 grid, that corresponds to this 3x3 grid here. And every place where you see that red triangle is going to be a danger cube that comes out. So right now, as it speaks, if nothing else is done, this is going to put a danger here, 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 and here. You don't want danger on the spots where your characters are, because if you do, you place it there, and at the end of the round, or the turn, any spots that have that danger that is corresponding will go into the area for each one, and it's a game loss condition if ever any one of those characters have 5 or more danger, so you don't want that to happen. What you do want to have is inspiration cubes in your spot, because those allow you to help pay for actions rather than having to pull blocks, which can be challenging. So the way the block pulling works is that you have to pull from below the top 3 rows. You can't pull from these top 3 rows, and you can use 1 finger to help stabilize. Now, this obviously is a little bit tricky in a solo game. You want to try to do it without cheating. So one thing I might want to do is spend a certain number of blocks to cover outline spaces on event cards. So right here, you can see this row is outlined by an orange box. So if I can get an orange cube or orange block to cover that, that's one less danger that I'm going to put out. I'm still going to have one on the senator and one on the scientist. The other thing I can do is potentially swap two event cards. So it might be nice to swap this card with that card, because this card, there's nothing happening here. And the scientist, engineer, and the senator, engineer, and scientist would move to the Senate. So let's say I was going to try to do that. I want to swap this card with this card so that at the end of this turn, I don't have any danger coming onto the board. Now, there's two things I can do. It costs one green. I can either spend this inspiration cube off of green to just do that, because this is counting for a green, or I could try to come over here and get one green block, and that's much more exciting. So let's try to do that. I'm actually going to pivot myself around the camera here and see if I can get one of these cubes to come out without toppling. That's not good. That's not looking good. Maybe, there we go. That one's looking a little better. Okay, so I've got this cube, or this block, which says it's either a purple or a green. So I'm going to use it for the green. I'm going to place it back on top of the HQ tower here. And now I can take the green action, which is swapping this card with this card. I took my actions, resolved the next event. No danger or inspiration is coming out on the grid. The senator, engineer, and scientist move to Senate. So all three of them are going to move up here. This card gets discarded. These slide down. And the next card that comes out is face down. I don't know what's coming. One of the actions that you can do is spend one red to reveal all the face down events. So if you've got multiple face down events and you don't really know what to plan for, then you can reveal them to give yourself a better idea. So that was one turn. Next thing I might want to do is get a green here, because that would prevent them from picking, or one of them from picking up a danger. And so maybe, let's just say I want to spend this inspiration cube. I don't want to try to risk pulling a green block. I would do that. This would be covered. One danger would go right here. I'm trying to pull the correct color. A danger would go there. These would be considered covered. Normally, if you actually had pulled the block, you would place it over the top of it like that. And that resolves that event. Goes away. These come down. And you continue like that. Now, you can also draw directive cards. Sometimes they're like on this particular event at the end, it tells you to draw and distribute 4 directive cards. So you can either draw them for an action, or you can get them through resolution of these events. And these cards are going to give you different ways that you can potentially do things better. The senator, engineer, or scientist gains 1 inspiration of any type. Now this one costs a purple to do it. Some of them have costs. Some of them do not. Move the scientist to any adjacent location and draw an objective card. So all of these are going to be ways that can potentially help you to get yourself through this challenge that you've got. The other thing that you might notice here are these blocks. When you can get inspiration cubes to fill up rows, you'll get an unlocked block which goes over here, and you can use that later on in the game. Just use that as an orange action. You don't have to pull it out of the tower. You just put it back up on the top. That's for the rows. For the columns, which are more difficult to fill up, you can get one of these 2, which can be an either or, which are more powerful and they're more difficult to get. And that's basically how you play through the game. You take your turns, you resolve the events, you play these directive cards, try not to get 5 or more danger, because that would be the end. Try to get through the whole deck. What happens, you might ask, if that tower tumbles? That's not good. If the tower tumbles, you have to resolve all 5 of the event all 5 event cards one by one. And if you're still alive at the end, then you can keep going. But for all intents and purposes, it's very hard to survive through 5 event cards that you can't mitigate in any way. So that's how the game plays. As I said, there are 3 different scenarios that change things up a little bit, but it's the same general structure that goes through the game. Let's head back over and I'll give you my final thoughts. Okay, hopefully that gives you a pretty good idea on how the solo game for Sarah's Vision plays out. So, the first thing I like to do is talk about some solo benchmarks. These are things that I like to use to assess a solo game. The first thing I like to talk about is win conditions. Is this a beat your high score variant or a win against a virtual opponent, win or loss against a virtual opponent? Well, this is a cooperative, a pure cooperative game. So basically, you have a clear win-loss condition. It's definitely not a beat your high score variant. Scores don't come into play at all. You either are successful in getting through that entire event deck or you are not. So this is perfectly fine in this type of game. This is what you're looking for, is knowing at any point that it could all come tumbling down. And in the case of Sarah's Vision, that's a very literal could all come tumbling down. So clear win-loss condition here for this game. The other thing I like to talk about is setup and teardown. Now, Sarah's Vision is a game that has a bit of setup, and the teardown is not bad at all because oftentimes things are already partially torn down. But the setup takes a bit of time. It's not outrageous compared to the amount of gameplay experience you're getting, so I think it's fine. But there is, something to account for. It's not a game that you're going to get off the shelf and be playing within 2 minutes. You do have to get the blocks stacked. You have to get your characters on the board. But I mean, you're talking 5 minutes. It's really not a bad setup time, and you're getting a pretty solid gameplay experience. It's not over in 5 minutes. Unless you do tremendously poorly, you're going to have a pretty good gameplay experience for the amount of time that you have for setup and teardown. Rules are another thing I like to talk about. And the rules for the game are fine. I wouldn't say they're great, and I wouldn't say they're terrible. They, generally speaking, lay out everything you need to know, but I do think that they probably could have gone into a bit more detail on some of these things. I feel like the organization of the rule book made things a little bit more confusing than they needed to be. Once I read through it a couple of times and started playing the game, things clicked and made sense. But just the first read through of the rule book, definitely there were some things that were confusing to me, that were worded strangely, that were in an order that I thought didn't make the most logical sense as far as how they're presented in the rule book. And so I think the rules could have been done better, although all the rules are there to play the game. I think generally speaking, you can learn the game from the rule book. I just wish they'd been a little bit clearer, a little bit more organized in the structure of the rule book. So, for the overall solo experience, what do I think of Sarah's Vision? Now, this is an interesting one because while it is a pure co-op and it lists one player on, as a player count on the box, I do wonder, is this better as a multiplayer game than as a solo game? And the answer is probably yes, because that central mechanic, that block tower mechanic, is one that creates inherent tension, right? It creates this tension, this palpable fear of it all coming tumbling down. And while that's there in a solo game, you still are concerned about that tower falling down. I feel like the more people around the table with a mechanic like that, the more that tension is going to ramp up because you're going to have people that are, and the more of that kind of energy that's in the room, the more that palpable feeling is heightened. And that's really what you're looking for in a game like this, because it essentially boils down to a danger threat mitigation game, a cooperative threat mitigation game. But what sets it apart is that tower of blocks. And so while that's still there and it's still perfectly viable in the solo game, I think it does lose a little bit as compared to the multiplayer game because you don't have that shared tension. And also it's a little bit different when you're having to kind of put your finger on the top of the tower and get another one out with another finger. It feels like it's a little too hard, or a little too easy, I should say, to kind of game it a little bit, to kind of really wiggle things around to get it to how you want it. You can't do that as easily when another person is holding it. So I do feel like it loses a little something in the solo game as compared to the multiplayer game. But overall, I still enjoyed the experience. Now, there are some inherent issues that I have with the game, and I feel like I should point those out up front. Number one, I feel like the plastic blocks, I wish they had a bit more weight to them. They felt a little bit too light, and and it's not quite as satisfying to manipulate those blocks out of the tower due to the weight. Sometimes it just felt a bit off. I don't really know exactly how to vocalize that, but it felt a bit off, like it needed just a little bit more heft to it to kind of really feel like you are manipulating those blocks to the best of your ability. So I do wish that that had been a bit of a different material that they used, or a different type of plastic, or maybe a little more fill in that plastic. That's a little bit underwhelming to me. So I had an issue with that. The other issue I have is potentially, I don't think there's a huge amount of replayability to the game. Now, from what I understand, this is a game that was based or built off of a corporate training exercise. A company had kind of commissioned this game as part of their team building, and that's a great idea. But as a result of that, the game feels a little bit finite, I suppose is the word that's coming to mind, where things are a bit scripted and a bit finite. Now, there are ways to get around that a little bit by shuffling up those event cards so that you don't know. Because once you've played through the scenarios a couple of times, you really are going to know what card is coming out, and you're going to probably mitigate those events the same way every time. And the only kind of randomizing factor will be how well you do in pulling those blocks. So being able to shuffle the event cards randomly and taking that whole story element out, which is really another issue, it's barely there, is one way that you can kind of add a bit to the replayability. But even with that, I don't think this is ever going to be a game that has huge replay potential. So that's something to definitely keep in mind. The last thing I was going to bring up that is a potential issue is the theme. I don't have a problem with the theme other than it really is barely there. I know that they tried to inject some of that story through flavor text on the event cards and those story cards, but I never really felt any immersion into that theme. I would struggle to tell you exactly what the game is about, other than you're just trying to resolve some events, and it's kind of a dystopian, futuristic type of a thing, self-driving cars running amok. So the theme is fine, except that I don't really feel like it's integrated into the game all that well. I'm not sure that it would have been possible through the mechanics, just based on the mechanics that they chose. So that is something to keep in mind. Now, those were some issues I had. I just have this underlying sense of enjoyment when I play the game. That's the one thing I keep coming back to. Do I have fun when I play it? And the answer is yes. I do have fun playing it. I don't think it's a game that I'm going to be able to play over and over again. But I will tell you this. This is a game that, as a solo game, every so often, I'm in the mood for these types of games, these kind of threat management, threat mitigation games. And there is no other game in my collection that utilizes this type of a mechanic in that way, other than, and I don't own Jenga, but if I had, that would be just that. I guess there's a threat mitigation inherent in that mechanic, but that being used in this game is novel to me. And is it a gimmick? Sure. But it works. It works. I like this gimmick in this game. I like that enhanced tension that it provides. So I enjoy the game. I have fun with the game, even with those caveats that I mentioned. Whether it's a game for you or not is one where you're going to have to assess whether those issues that I brought up would be enough for it not to come out on your table very often. Not huge replayability. A couple of production issues I think were a little bit different. However, I am going to give Sarah's Vision a 7 out of 10 and a seal of approval. Just because I enjoy the game. I think it's fun. I think it's novel. It doesn't play like anything else that I have. Although I'm not going to want to pull it off the shelf often, the times that I do, I really have fun with it. So if it sounds interesting to you, it might be one to check out. Thank you so much for your time as always, and have a great day.